Hello, chess fans. Today I have a beautiful miniature for you from Mikhail Tal. This game is played in 1963 against an unknown opponent. The game centers on the incredibly sharp Polyugaevsky variation, where Tal unleashes a trap that you could actually use in your games today. Let's see how we get into this Polyugaevsky variation here. Tal opened up the game with pawn e4, and we follow the main lines here: c5, knight f3, d6, d4. Black develops and attacks e4. We defend with knight c3, and now a6. Of course, a6 is the introduction to the Najdorf variation, one of the great variations in the Sicilian Defense, one of the great openings in all of chess. And in this game, Black is going to pursue the Polyugaevsky variation, which is a sub-variation of the Najdorf, but it's particularly sharp and it has its own themes that are different than other Najdorf variations. So bishop g5 here, this is the sharpest line available to white. I really enjoy playing this myself, and I think modern analysis by Negi, a great Indian grandmaster, actually shows that this can be used on the highest levels today, and I think there's been a real revival of this very sharp line. So pawn e6, f4, and now the question is, what are you gonna do about this e5 push? Now, normally Black can play moves like bishop h7, which is very, very popular. You can also play something like queen c7, or you can go for queen b6 and the poison pawn variation. In this game, Black decides to play pawn to b5, a move that at the time was all the rage. This was invented by Lev Polyugaevsky, a great player of the time, and I think one of Tal's great nemesis. Together, they played many, many brilliant games. Polyugaevsky actually wrote a wonderful, wonderful book called Grandmaster Preparation, where he talked a lot about inventing this very sharp variation and how the top players that he was playing against would try and come up with ideas from the white side to blow him off the board when he tried this, and then he would come up with defenses, and there was this really interesting analysis going back and forth as played out in these high-level games featuring the Polyugaevsky variation. In this game, after b5, Tal, of course, continues with the big question. e5, what are you doing? Now, I was threatening this move, b5, preparing naturally bishop b7 and b4, and these kinds of typical Sicilian moves didn't stop me from playing e5 here, putting pressure on your pinned knight. Am I not winning the knight on f6? How are you defending? Well, the entire point of the Polyugaevsky variation is that after the trade here on e5, Black has this move, queen c7. Without this move, Black would be totally busted. The point now is that if you take on f6, which is actually the most popular move here, Black has queen e5 check, and then you're picking up the bishop on g5. Now, there's a ton of theory here, and we're not going to unpack all of it, but although Black is kind of happy to have dismantled the white center, white is no longer going to be in possession of central pawns at the end of all of this. White does maintain a big lead in development, and certainly Black is under a lot of pressure, but the play is very interesting and exciting for both sides. In this game, after queen c7, Tal picks the second most popular move, which is queen to e2. Tal's idea is, I'm not going to take here on f6, which will lead eventually to the loss of my pawn. I'm just going to keep this nice strong pawn on e5, and it will help facilitate my attack. Now, Black's point after knight d7 is that this pawn is weak. Maybe I just win this pawn, and then I'll be up a pawn, and I will hope to win the game from there. Tal continues with castling, and now capturing on e5 is just too risky. If you do knight takes e5 right here, white has a lot of crushing moves. For example, knight takes here. When you're attacking the queen, you're also still on this, and rook d8 mate is a big problem that is super, super crunchy. And if queen takes e5, we also have trouble after queen takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes b5. Again, we have threats of mate, and now we also have threats of knight c7. So Black is not in a position to capture on e5, but Black is still hoping this pawn will be weak. Maybe I get it eventually. Black develops here with bishop b7. This is the most popular move, and actually the most popular move for white now is queen g4, which has a very good score, a good enough score to deter Black from playing this line most of the time today, although you will still see Black attempt to play this way. Instead, though, we're going to see something different from Tal. We're going to see the second most popular move, but it's definitely the one that bears the stamp of Tal. That is the move knight takes e6. This is a very, very dangerous move for black to meet. This piece sacrifice is exactly the kind of move that Tal loves to play here. Maybe black can hold on, but white's attacking ideas are very, very dangerous, and practically it's incredibly hard for black to avoid going down in flames in just a few moves, which is what happens in this game. Now, black doesn't really have a choice other than capturing the knight. For example, if you play queen takes e5, then boom. This is actually mate in 1 because the e-file has been thoroughly opened up and black is not able to capture on c7 because we have a pin on the queen on e5. So after knight takes e6, we see pawn takes e6 here, and now queen g4 going after the e6 pawn. And if white were able to capture e6 in this position, it would actually be forced checkmate after the bishop blocks and queen takes e7. So the whole question is, what is black going to do about this e6 pawn? Now, a couple of choices are available. First off, we should mention knight c5, which tries to defend this pawn and kind of develop this knight, which will improve black's coordination. The problem is that in this case, white can either immediately or after a piece sacrifice with bishop takes b5, go for rook d8 check. And this is going to force black to give up the queen for the rook and the bishop here. And this is a very, very strong position for white. Now, materially, black is even up, but in this position, the move b4 is going to force the knight to abandon the e6 pawn, which will return us to some kind of material equality. But black is in a very difficult position because it's very hard to coordinate all of those scattered pieces, and the king is obviously extremely exposed here on a8. So white's advantage is significant, even if we couldn't necessarily say that it is enough to objectively win the game. A better alternative for black after queen g4 here is queen takes e5. Now, queen takes e5 would terrify me. I would not want to capture on e5 under basically any circumstances. It looks so dangerous to capture this pawn and just open more lines of attack for white on the e-file. But black can hold on here. Strong for white is bishop d3, which maintains a very good compensation. And just to point out, if black plays something like knight c6 in this position, a developing move that doesn't pay attention to what's going on, you can pause your video to find the refutation. Sure, this is great, but better is queen h5 check, and then queen takes g6. Definitely don't go for bishop takes g6. You want your brilliancy prize, and we have mate right here. So white definitely has compensation after queen takes e5 with bishop d3, but moves that try to blow black out of the water don't quite work. For example, very tempting is bishop takes b5, when after a takes b5, rook h e1 looks great. Okay, you're down 2 pieces, but you're about to win e6 and should win the game right. Black holds on narrowly, though, with h5 here. This is an important move. You leave the queen hanging for a moment to disrupt the queen here. The queen doesn't have a lot of good choices in terms of squares because, of course, you can't allow a queen trade, and you have to defend this bishop here on g5. So that leaves you queen h4 here, and now after just moving, black is actually holding on here. H5 gives some room to the king, and it also means that the queen can't get to h5 because the rook is defending that square. So rook takes e6, king f7 still looks nice for white, but white has no knockout blow and is still down 2 pieces. Black should be able to hang on and win this game. So all that analysis is there just to show that this was the move if you wanted to survive this game, although you're definitely still going to need to tiptoe carefully, and white has compensation. That's not what's played, though. In this game, black plays the move queen to b6. Now, this loses immediately tactically, It's a good time to pause your video and try and figure out why it loses immediately tactically. But even if we set aside the tactics for a moment, I think it's pretty obvious that this is not a very desirable move because it doesn't really accomplish anything. It does defend e6, but you're not developing, you're not improving your piece coordination. And the answer to the question, how does white blow black out of the water here, is simply the move rook d6, which is a classic interference here, breaking the coordination between the queen and the e6 square. So there's no defense for black now. So black does play bishop takes d6, queen takes e6, check now, king f8, the only move that doesn't get checkmated in one move, which is blocking with the bishop and then getting captured there. And this is a great moment to again pause your video and ask yourself, how would I play like Mikhail Tal? Well, the way that Mikhail Tal played, and I assume that you found this as well, is bishop c4. There are many winning moves, but this is the prettiest and the strongest. It is in fact mate in 5. After bishop c4, of course, we don't care at all that this bishop is hanging because the number one point of bishop c4 is just to free f1 for the rook. The second point, though, is also pretty good. We're threatening mate in 1 here on f7. So with no better choices, black does go ahead and capture that bishop. And now rook to f1 check. There are only a few blocks available to black, but the only one that kind of makes sense is the knight block here, as the knight is defended by the pawn, but that doesn't really matter. Again, you can pause your video if you want to find the best way forward. Well, any capture of the knight is going to be pretty great, but the best capture is rook takes f6, which is mate in 2 because of g takes, and bishop h6, a mate that looks a bit here like the Boden checkmate. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful stuff from Tal. Certainly not the most challenging game he's ever won, but a lovely one. I think we all dream of playing this kind of attack against the Sicilian, and maybe now that you've seen this game, you will be able to achieve something similar. If you like that game, then of course, as always, you can click on the board right over here for more fantastic games from Mikhail Tal.